Every alien race within the Galactic Commonwealth was a race of spineless pacifist cowards, unwilling to stand up and fight for their freedom, while only humans possessed the bravery and warrior spirit needed to defend themselves from annihilation. Will Crawford forcefully twisted the hydro-spanner as he worked to repair the Tellarite ship that had arrived unexpectedly at the Olympus Mons spaceport on Mars. It was humanity's first face-to-face encounter with an alien species. The dockhands had been shocked when the tapered silver craft gracefully touched down on Landing Pad 5, requesting mechanical assistance. As an engineer with the Martian Repair Corps, Will had readily agreed to help the visitors. Something about the behavior of the Tellarites struck Will as odd from the start. For a species advanced enough to traverse the stars, they appeared unusually skittish and high-strung. Their triangular ears twitched at the slightest sounds, and their small dark eyes darted about anxiously. Will's universal translator picked up snatches of hushed conversation between the gray-skinned aliens, discussions that seemed to center around an ominous threat to their civilization. His curiosity piqued, Will decided to broach the subject with the Tellarite captain. "You folks seem a bit on edge," Will remarked to Deneb as he handed the alien a fused power coupling. "Anything you want to share? I'm happy to listen." Deneb hesitated, glancing around the cluttered workspace as if afraid of being overheard. Then it sighed, a whistling exhalation through its narrow nostrils. "I suppose there is no harm in telling you. A vicious race called the Vraxar have besieged our colonies, bombarding cities from orbit and sending down troops to butcher civilians. We Tellarites follow the path of peace. We have no warriors or warships to defend against their predations." Will frowned, taken aback by the frank admission. "If these Vraxar are raiding your territory and slaughtering your people, why the hell aren't you fighting back? No one has the right to attack you like that." "Fighting is not our way," Deneb replied, his tone mournful. "Our leaders have decided to surrender unconditionally in the hopes that the Vraxar will be merciful overlords. Resisting would only lead to more death." Will shook his head vehemently. "Bullshit. Rolling over and letting them conquer you won't solve a damn thing. It'll just tell the Vraxar that the Tellarites are easy pickings. They'll keep expanding and killing until someone stops them." "We weren't always this way," Deneb said wistfully. "Centuries ago, in the age before we achieved spacefaring capability, my kind were known as tenacious warriors. But those days are long past. We chose the road of diplomacy and eschewed the old militaristic ways. Our armed forces have withered, and our martial skills are lost to time." Will put down his tools and looked Deneb square in the eyes. "Sometimes diplomacy isn't enough. Sometimes you have to be willing to put your ass on the line and fight for what you believe in. Freedom has a price. And that price is having the guts to defend it when scumbags like the Vraxar come knocking. You can't just sit back and hope for the best." The Tellarite opened his mouth to respond, but suddenly klaxons sounded throughout the hangar. "Warning," a robotic voice announced over the intercom. "Long-range sensors detect multiple unidentified warships entering the solar system on approach vector to Mars. This is not a drill. All civilians report to shelters. Planetary defense forces to battle stations." Deneb's eyes went wide with fear. "The Vraxar! They followed us here." The Tellarite dashed up his ship's entry ramp, yelling for his crew to make for orbit. Will ran after him, boots thudding on the metal decking. "Wait, you can't just run. Stay and help us warn the colony," Will shouted. "I cannot risk it," Deneb called over his shoulder. "We did not intend to bring trouble to your species' doorstep. We must go before the Vraxar arrive." With that, he slapped the ramp controls and sealed himself inside his vessel. Will could only watch, fists clenched in rage, as the Tellarite ship lifted off and streaked up into the salmon skies of Mars. The human cursed the aliens for fleeing, even as a small part of him understood their overwhelming fear. But he had no time to dwell on it. Will sprinted from the docking bay, already keying the comm unit on his wrist. There weren't enough Navy ships in orbit to turn back a full invasion force. This would come down to the grit and guns of the Martian militias. They had to hold the line. Will knew the coming hours would test the mettle of the human spirit like never before. With the Tellarites and other Commonwealth races unwilling to resist naked aggression, it fell to mankind to draw a line in the red sands and declare, "This far and no further." Word of this unprecedented military stand would spread to the stars. Today, humanity would show the galaxy that they were made from far sterner stuff than most. "Let the Vraxar come and break upon our unbreakable will," Will thought grimly. "Let them crash like a wave against the unshakable cliff face of human courage, and let our defiance resound across the void." The Martian defense sirens wailed as the people rushed to their posts, prepared to sell their lives dearly for the sake of freedom. It was do or die, and if death came to Mars, then the humans would teach the enemy the true meaning of Pyrrhic victory. Against all odds they would fight, and they would win, for losing was not an option. Not now, not ever. Will sprinted through the corridors of the Mars colony, his boots pounding against the metal floors. He skidded to a halt at the command center and burst through the doors, out of breath. "Commander Jackson, General Thorne, we have incoming hostiles. A race called the Vraxar. They followed the Tellarites here." The two officers snapped to attention, their faces grim. General Thorne barked orders into his comm unit, while Commander Jackson turned to Will. "What do we know about their capabilities?" "Not much," Will admitted. "But they've been raiding Tellarite colonies. We need to prepare for a fight." Alarms blared throughout the settlement as the military leaders sprang into action. Soldiers rushed to their posts while civilians headed for the shelters. Will watched the orbital displays as defense platforms powered up, their massive laser arrays coming online. On the ground, missile batteries emerged from hidden silos, primed and ready. "All fighters scramble! This is not a drill!" The flight controller's voice echoed through the base as pilots raced to their ships. Will joined his engineering team, fingers flying over consoles as they worked to maximize the colony's defenses. "Reroute auxiliary power to the shield generators," he ordered, "and get me a status report on our weapon systems." The minutes ticked by in a blur of activity. Then a hush fell over the command center as the first Vraxar ships appeared on the long-range sensors. "My God," someone whispered as the alien fleet came into view. Will's jaw dropped at the sight of the massive blade-shaped vessels filled with weaponry. They dwarfed the human ships, casting ominous shadows across the red Martian landscape. Without warning, lances of energy erupted from the Vraxar ships. Plasma torpedoes streaked toward the colony, impacting against the shields in dazzling explosions. The entire base shuddered under the barrage. "Shields holding at 82%, an officer called out. Outside, human fighters swarmed to meet the Vraxar assault craft. The sky above Mars erupted in a spectacular firefight. Despite being outnumbered, the skilled human pilots held their own, sending several enemy ships spiraling to the ground in flames. Will and his team worked frantically, rerouting power and pushing systems beyond their limits to keep the defenses operational. Sweat beaded on their brows as they raced against time. A new alert blared. "Incoming dropships! Ground forces deploying!" Will watched in horror as thousands of Vraxar troops poured from their landers. The alien soldiers charged toward the colony perimeter, where human marines waited in hastily dug trenches and fortified positions. The quiet Martian evening erupted in the thunder of explosions and the chatter of gunfire as the two forces clashed. Tracers lit up the sky while rockets streaked back and forth. The aliens pressed forward relentlessly, but the humans refused to yield an inch of ground. Suddenly, the command center rocked violently. Sparks showered from damaged consoles as the lights flickered. "We've been breached," someone shouted. "Vraxar boarding pods incoming." The engineers looked at each other in shock as the realization sank in. They were about to become frontline soldiers. Will grabbed a rifle from a weapon locker, his hands shaking slightly as he checked the magazine. "All right, team, let's show these bastards what humans are made of." The Vraxar burst through the doors, their alien battle cries sending chills down Will's spine. But he stood his ground, squeezing off careful shots alongside his comrades. They used their knowledge of the command center's systems to their advantage, overloading power conduits to create electrical traps and venting coolant to slow the alien advance. Outside, the battle raged on. Despite mounting casualties, the The human defenders fought with fierce purpose. They knew surrender meant the end of everything they held dear. As Will reloaded his weapon, he noticed the tactical displays showing the colony's defenses on the verge of collapse. The Vraxar were simply too numerous, too well armed. It seemed hopeless. Then, without warning, new contacts appeared on the sensors. A fresh wave of ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel near Mars. Friend or foe, Will couldn't tell. But he knew their arrival would decide the fate of the battle, and perhaps humanity's future among the stars. The command center shook as another barrage of Vraxar fire struck the colony's shields. Will gritted his teeth, knowing they couldn't hold out much longer. Suddenly, the sensor officer shouted, "New contacts! Multiple ships dropping out of hyperspace!" Will's heart sank, fearing reinforcements for the Vraxar. But as he looked at the display, his jaw dropped. A fleet of sleek Tellarite warships had appeared, their weapons already firing on the Vraxar vessels. At the head of the formation, Will recognized Deneb's ship. "What the hell?" he muttered, unable to believe his eyes. The unexpected arrival of the Tellarites threw the Vraxar into disarray. Their precise formation broke apart as they scrambled to face this new threat. Will seized the opportunity, barking orders to redirect their remaining defenses to exploit the gaps in the enemy lines. His comm unit crackled to life with an incoming transmission. Deneb's face appeared on the screen, a determined set to his jaw that Will hadn't seen before. "Greetings, human friend. I hope we're not too late to join the party," Deneb said. Will couldn't hide his shock. "Deneb? I thought you'd run. What are you doing here?" The Tellarite's expression turned solemn. "Your words struck a chord, Will. After we left, I realized I couldn't live with myself if I abandoned you to face this threat alone. I contacted some like-minded members of our leadership and convinced them it was time to fight back. We gathered what ships and soldiers we could and came to aid you. With the Tellarites now in the fight, the tide began to turn. Will coordinated with Deneb, using the humans' knowledge of Vraxar tactics and the Tellarites' advanced technology to maximum effect. They targeted key enemy ships, disrupting their command structure and creating chaos in their ranks. On the ground, Will led a strike team to disable the Vraxar dropships. They moved swiftly through the Martian landscape, using the terrain for cover. As they approached the first ship, Will signaled his team to fan out. "Plant the charges on the engines and fuel cells," he ordered. "We need to make sure these bastards can't use them to escape." As they worked, Will noticed Tellarite troops joining the human defenders at the colony perimeter. The aliens fought with a ferocity that belied their earlier pacifist claims, their energy weapons carving swaths through the Vraxar ranks. In orbit, the space battle raged on. The Tellarite ships took heavy fire, but their shields held firm. Deneb's voice came over the comm again. "Our military maintained a secret weapons development program, despite our leaders' pacifist leanings. It seems their foresight has paid off today." The human ships, emboldened by their allies' arrival, pressed their attack. Massive Vraxar dreadnoughts, once seemingly invincible, now cracked and burned under the combined assault. As Will's team finished sabotaging the last dropship, he heard a change in the sounds of battle. The Vraxar lines were breaking. Their remaining ships began to disengage, recalling their ground forces as they prepared to retreat. "They're running!" someone shouted over the comm. A ragged cheer went up from the human and Tellarite forces. Hours later, as the dust settled, Will stood in the command center once more. This time, Deneb stood beside him, both of them battered but alive. The Tellarite turned to Will, his eyes shining with newfound purpose. "I must thank you, Will. Your courage inspired us to remember our own. Perhaps we needed this reminder of what it means to truly stand for one's beliefs." Will nodded, a wry smile on his face. "I'm just glad you came back. We couldn't have done this without you." As they spoke, human and Tellarite leaders were already deep in discussion, hammering out the framework for a formal alliance. The threat of the Vraxar loomed large, but for the first time, there was hope. Will couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. The Tellarites' initial retreat, which he had seen as cowardice, had actually given them the time they needed to rally their forces and return as allies. As Will and Deneb walked through the colony, surveying the damage and beginning the process of rebuilding, an urgent message came through on both their communicators. They exchanged a glance before answering the call. A grim-faced Tellarite official appeared on the screen. "We've detected a massive Vraxar fleet gathering in a nearby system. Our analysts believe they're preparing for a full-scale invasion of both human and Tellarite space." Will's stomach tightened at the news, but he felt a surge of purpose. He looked at Deneb and saw the same commitment mirrored in the alien's eyes. "Looks like this was just the beginning," Will said. Deneb nodded. "Indeed, but this time we face the threat together." As they began to discuss strategies for the coming conflict, Will knew that the true test of their newfound alliance lay ahead. The battle for Mars had been won, but the war for survival was just beginning. The command center buzzed with frantic activity as Will Crawford and Deneb stood before the holographic display, their faces illuminated by the flickering red indicators of Vraxar incursions across multiple sectors. Commander Jackson paced behind them, his boots echoing on the metal floor. "We're running out of options," Jackson said, his voice tight. "Our losses are mounting and the Vraxar keep coming." Will leaned forward, zooming in on a particular section of the map. "I have an idea," he said, his voice low. "It's risky, but it might be our only shot." All eyes turned to him as he outlined his plan. Will pulled up schematics of an ancient Tellarite weapon, a massive railgun cannon that dwarfed anything in their current arsenal. "These plans were buried in the intel we gathered from our raids," Will explained, pointing to specific sections of the design. "It's powerful enough to penetrate any known defensive system." Deneb's eyes widened as he recognized the weapon. "The Hammer of Tellar," he whispered. "We thought those plans were lost millennia ago." Will nodded grimly. "They were until now. But there's a catch. It needs more power than we can currently generate." He tapped a few controls, bringing up diagrams of their remaining capital ships. "We use the reactor cores from our ships as a makeshift power source. It's essentially sacrificing most of our fleet, but it might give us the punch we need." Silence fell over the room as the implications sank in. Deneb was the first to speak, his voice heavy with concern. "Will, if this fails, we'll be defenseless against any future Vraxar attacks. It's too great a risk." Will turned to face his friend, his eyes blazing with intensity. "If we succeed, there won't be any future attacks. The devastation to their homeworld would cripple their ability to wage war for years, maybe decades." The debate raged for hours, voices rising and falling as scenarios were proposed and discarded. Finally, Commander Jackson raised his hand for silence. "We're out of alternatives," he said, his voice weary. "Let's do it." The next weeks passed in a blur of feverish activity. In the outer reaches of the Eridani system, a massive construction project took shape. Will worked alongside Tellarite scientists and human engineers, his hands covered in grease as they assembled the colossal weapon. Nearby, crews stripped down capital ships, carefully extracting their warp cores and reactors. The precious power sources were integrated into a complex network of conduits and regulators, all feeding into the railgun's hungry maw. As they worked, reports trickled in of diversionary attacks launched across multiple sectors. Will's strike teams executed daring raids, capturing key Vraxar leaders for interrogation. Each piece of intelligence they gathered was another fragment in the puzzle of the Vraxar homeworld's defenses. Finally, the day of reckoning arrived. Will stood on the bridge of the flagship, watching as the combined human and Tellarite fleet took up protective positions around the railgun. The weapon itself hung in space like a metal leviathan, its barrel stretching impossibly far into the void. "All ships prepare for jump," Commander Jackson's voice crackled over the comms. "May God have mercy on our souls." In a flash of light, the fleet materialized in the Vraxar home system. Immediately, alarms blared as enemy ships swarmed toward them. "All fighters, engage!" Will shouted. "Bombers, commence your runs!" The space around them erupted in chaos. Laser fire crisscrossed the void, and explosions bloomed like silent flowers. Will watched the tactical display, searching for the narrow window they needed. "There!" he shouted, pointing to a gap in the Vraxar formation. "Fire the railgun, now!" For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a flash that outshone the system's star, the railgun discharged. A tungsten projectile, accelerated to near light speed, lanced out toward the Vraxar homeworld. Will watched, heart pounding, as the projectile struck. Even from this distance, he could see the planet's shields flare and fail, armor crumpling smoothly. The impact gouged a continent-sized crater in the planet's surface. The bridge rocked as shockwaves rippled through space-time itself. Alarms blared, and for a moment, Will feared they'd torn reality itself asunder. As the chaos subsided, an eerie silence fell over the comms. The Vraxar ships hung motionless, their crews likely as stunned as the Allies by the weapon's devastation. "All ships disengage," Commander Jackson ordered, his voice hoarse. "Let's go home." As they jumped away, leaving the shattered Vraxar homeworld behind, Will stared out at the stars. They'd won, but at a terrible cost. The once unstoppable Vraxar war machine lay in ruins, but so did much of the Allied fleet. As they limped back to friendly space, Will couldn't help but wonder, what would be the price of this victory in the years to come? The acrid stench of burnt circuitry filled the air as Will Crawford stumbled through the smoky corridors of his battered ship. Sparks rained down from ruptured conduits, and the deck plates vibrated with the strain of overtaxed engines. "Damage report!" Will barked into his comm unit. "Hull breaches on decks 3 through 7, a harried voice responded. "Life support at 60% capacity. Weapon systems offline." Will cursed under his breath. The gambit had worked, but the cost had been staggering. He made his way to the bridge where Deneb stood hunched over a flickering tactical display. "How bad is it?" Will asked, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. Deneb's eyes met his, filled with a mix of triumph and sorrow. "We've lost nearly half our fleet, but the Vraxar homeworld, it's done for." Will nodded grimly. He opened his mouth to speak when a shrill alarm cut through the air. The sensor officer's voice rang out, panic evident in his tone. "Multiple contacts incoming. Vraxar signatures. At least 50 ships." "Impossible," Will muttered, leaning in to study the readout. But there it was, a massive Vraxar fleet bearing down on their position at maximum warp. Will and Deneb exchanged a look of grim understanding. Their battered forces couldn't hope to repel another assault. "All ships, this is Commander Crawford." Will broadcast across the fleet-wide channel. "Initiate emergency withdrawal protocols. Fall back to Rendezvous Point Delta." As the order went out, chaos erupted. Ships began jumping to hyperspace, their engines flaring bright against the void. But not all made it. Vraxar scouts tore into the retreating Allies, energy weapons lashing out and carving through weakened shields. Will gritted his teeth, watching as a Tellarite cruiser took a direct hit to its engines. "Bring us about," he ordered. "We're covering their retreat." His ship swung into action, interposing itself between the Vraxar attackers and the fleeing Allies. Will's hands flew over the controls, executing a series of wild maneuvers that kept the enemy off balance. "Sir," his comms officer shouted, "the Tellarite ship Veronak is reporting a critical reactor breach. They're carrying over 300 wounded and civilians." Will's blood ran cold. He knew what he had to do. "Belay that withdrawal order," he snapped. "We're going in." Ignoring the protests of his bridge crew, Will pushed his ship to its limits, closing the distance to the stricken Tellarite vessel. Enemy fire intensified, rocking the ship violently. "All available hands to the shuttle bays," Will ordered. "Prepare for emergency evacuation procedures." What followed was a hellish gauntlet of fire and chaos. Will's boarding teams raced against time, ferrying survivors from the dying Tellarite ship, while Vraxar fighters swarmed around them. The deck beneath Will's feet bucked and heaved as his ship took hit after hit. "Last group aboard," came the call from the shuttle bay. "Execute emergency jump sequence," Will shouted. The stars elongated around them as they leapt into hyperspace, narrowly evading the closing noose of Vraxar ships. But their victory was short-lived. Alarms blared throughout the ship as systems began to fail. "Coolant leak in the main reactor," his chief engineer reported. "We can't sustain this jump." Will scanned the nearby star charts, searching for any viable option. "There," he said, pointing to a small, unremarkable moon. "We'll set down there." The landing was more of a controlled crash. Will's ship plowed a deep furrow across the moon's barren surface before finally grinding to a halt. As the dust settled, Will emerged from the wreckage, helping injured crew members to safety. Deneb and Commander Jackson joined him, their faces smeared with grime and blood. "We need to establish a defensive perimeter," Jackson said, ever the tactician. Will nodded. "And a triage center for the wounded. Use whatever supplies we salvaged from the Varanok." They worked tirelessly, setting up makeshift shelters and jury-rigging defense systems from the wreckage of their ship. Will moved among the survivors, offering words of encouragement and lending a hand where needed. As the makeshift camp took shape, Deneb approached Will, his expression grave. "Long-range sensors are picking up Vraxar energy signatures. They're closing in on our position." Will looked out across the desolate landscape, his mind racing. They had no ships capable of outrunning the enemy, and their defenses were pitiful at best. "We make our stand here," Will said, his voice firm. "We've come too far to give up now." As they prepared for what seemed like a final, hopeless battle, a new alarm sounded. Will's heart sank, expecting to see the Vraxar bearing down on them. Instead, his eyes widened in disbelief. "Those are our ships," Deneb said, incredulous. Sure enough, the vanguard of the main Allied fleet appeared in the sky above them, a sight more welcome than any Will had ever seen. The fleet's arrival cast long shadows across the moon's desolate surface as dropships descended, their engines kicking up plumes of dust. Will watched as medics rushed to and fro, loading the wounded onto stretchers and whisking them away to waiting medical bays. Commander Jackson strode up, his face etched with weariness. "Good work holding out, Crawford. Let's get these people to safety." Will nodded, helping a limping Tellarite engineer onto a nearby shuttle. The evacuation proceeded with practiced efficiency, and soon the makeshift camp stood empty. Aboard Jackson's flagship, Will and Deneb found themselves in a cramped war room, surrounded by holographic displays of Vraxar territory. The air hung heavy with tension as Allied commanders debated their next move. A grizzled Tellarite admiral hit his fist on the table. "We can't just sit here licking our wounds. The Vraxar won't give us that luxury." "Agreed," Jackson said, turning to Will. "Crawford, you've got more first-hand experience against these bastards than anyone. What's your take?" Will stepped forward, zooming in on a cluster of Vraxar-held systems. "We hit them hard, but they're not out of the fight. Our intel suggests they're already regrouping." He manipulated the display, highlighting key strategic points. Shipyards here, supply depots there, and command nodes scattered throughout. If we can strike these targets, we might cripple their ability to launch a sustained offensive. The room erupted in heated discussion. Will laid out his plan for a series of lightning raids, utilizing small, fast-moving strike teams to penetrate deep into enemy territory. Hours passed as they hashed out the details. Finally, Jackson nodded. "It's risky as hell, but it might be our only shot. You've got the green light, Crawford." The next days were a blur of preparation. Will personally vetted each member of his strike team, seeking out the sharpest minds and steadiest hands in the fleet. "I need people who can think on their feet," he told a seasoned human pilot. "We'll be deep in enemy territory with no backup. Can you handle that?" The pilot's eyes gleamed with tenacity. "Just point me at the target, sir." As the deadline approached, Will stood in the hangar bay, surveying the sleek frigates and fighters that would carry them into battle. Deneb approached, running a hand along the hull of the nearest ship. "Vraxar cloaking tech," he mused. "Never thought I'd see the day we'd use their own weapons against them." Will nodded grimly. "Let's hope it gives us the edge we need." The mission began with a tense journey through enemy space, their ships ghosting past Vraxar patrols under the cover of stolen cloaking technology. Will's palms were slick with sweat as they approached their first target, a massive dilithium refinery orbiting a gas giant. "All units, execute on my mark," Will whispered into the comm. 3, 2, 1, now. The Allied ships decloaked in perfect unison, unleashing a devastating barrage on the unprepared refinery. Antimatter torpedoes streaked through space, slamming into key structural points with pinpoint accuracy. As alarms blared and Vraxar ships scrambled to respond, Will's voice cut through the chaos. "Phase 2, hit your secondary targets and fall back to the rally point." The strike force scattered, each ship peeling off to strike pre-designated targets across the system. Will's own vessel dove toward a nearby shipyard, weaving through the debris of destroyed Vraxar vessels. "Incoming!" Deneb shouted from the sensor station. 4 Vraxar cruisers on an intercept course." Will's hands flew over the controls, pushing the ship into a series of wild, evasive maneuvers. "Launch antimatter warheads, full spread." The warheads found their mark, gutting the orbital shipyard even as Will punched through the disintegrating Vraxar formation. Similar scenes played out across Vraxar space as the Allied wolf packs struck target after target, leaving destruction in their wake. Days turned into weeks as the campaign raged on. Will's strike force grew adept at hit-and-fade tactics, striking hard and vanishing before the Vraxar could mount an effective response. But the constant pressure began to take its toll. During one particularly harrowing operation, Will's ship shuddered under the impact of a Vraxar ambush. Sparks flew from ruptured consoles as the deck plates buckled beneath their feet. "We've lost engines!" the chief engineer shouted over the din of alarms. "Hull breach on deck 3! Will gritted his teeth, assessing their options. A Tellarite bomber lay crippled nearby, its crew trapped as Vraxar kill teams closed in. "Deneb, get our people to the escape pods," Will ordered. "I'll hold them off as long as I can." What followed was a desperate battle against overwhelming odds. Will and a handful of volunteers used every trick in the book to keep the Vraxar at bay. They jury-rigged force fields, set traps in narrow corridors, and fought with a ferocity born of desperation. In the end, it was barely enough. As the last of the strike group jumped to safety, Will and his ragtag band of defenders limped to the escape pods, their ship a smoking ruin behind them. Floating in the cold void of space, Will watched as Allied ships swooped in to recover the pods. He let out a long, shaky breath, the adrenaline finally ebbing from his system. "We did it," Deneb said quietly beside him. "We bought them the time they needed." Will nodded, his eyes fixed on the stars beyond. They had won this round, but he knew the war was just getting started. The Vraxar would be back, and next time, they would be out for blood. The acrid smell of ozone and scorched circuitry filled the air as Will Crawford stepped onto the bridge of Commander Jackson's flagship. His uniform was stained with sweat and grime, a testament to the grueling campaign they'd just endured. Deneb followed close behind, his antennae twitching as he surveyed the bustling command center. "Crawford, Deneb," Jackson nodded, his face etched with fatigue. "Glad you made it. We've got a lot to discuss." Will's eyes were drawn to the massive holographic display dominating the center of the room. It showed a sea of red icons, Vraxar ships, slowly coalescing into a single massive formation. "What are we looking at?" Will asked, his voice low. A young ensign at the sensor station spoke up. "Long-range scans, sir. The Vraxar are pulling everything they have left into one giant armada." Will leaned in, studying the display intently. "They're going all in. One final push to wipe us out." "Exactly," Jackson confirmed. "Our raids hurt them, but it wasn't enough to break their will. Now they're out for blood." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Will's mind raced, analyzing potential strategies and discarding them just as quickly. Finally, he looked up, his eyes blazing with intensity. "We can't let them finish forming up," he said. "If that armada gets moving, nothing we have will be able to stop it. We need to hit them now before they're ready." Deneb stepped forward, manipulating the holographic controls. "I concur. and I believe I've found our target. The display zoomed in on a heavily fortified anchorage. We intercepted Vraxar communications. This is where they're gathering their heaviest warships and most elite troops. Will studied the schematics, his trained eye picking out defensive emplacements and patrol patterns. Suddenly, he froze, zeroing in on a specific section of the base. There, he pointed, the reactor complex. It's powered by liquid thermonuclear fuel. If we could destabilize it, the whole base would go up like a supernova, Jackson finished, his eyes widening. Will nodded grimly. It's a long shot, but if we can slip in under cloak, we might just pull it off. A small team could infiltrate, plant charges, and trigger an overload. The room erupted in heated discussion. Officers argued back and forth, weighing the astronomical risks against their dwindling options. Finally, Jackson raised his hand for silence. It's insane, he said, looking directly at Will, but it's the best shot we've got. Make it happen, Crawford. The next hours were a whirlwind of preparation. Will handpicked his team, selecting the most skilled infiltrators, combat engineers, and demolitions experts from both human and Tellarite ranks. They pored over stolen Vraxar schematics, memorizing every corridor and access point of their target. As Will strapped himself into the pilot's seat of their captured Vraxar stealth frigate, Deneb's voice crackled over the comm. All teams report ready. We're green across the board. Will took a deep breath, his hands steady on the controls. Copy that. All units, engage cloaking devices and proceed to jump coordinates. This is it, people. No room for error. The starfield outside stretched and blurred as they made the jump to hyperspace. Tense minutes passed in silence before they reverted to normal space, the massive Vraxar anchorage looming before them. Scanning for patrol routes, Deneb reported, adjusting course to avoid detection. Will guided their ship through a series of precise maneuvers, weaving between sensor pickets and minefields. Sweat beaded on his forehead as they slipped past the outer defensive ring. Suddenly, alarms blared. We've been spotted, Deneb shouted. Vraxar interceptors inbound. All units, execute emergency breach protocol, Will ordered, jamming the throttle forward. Their ship surged ahead, abandoning stealth for raw speed. Chaos erupted as they smashed through the anchorage's inner defenses. Will's fingers flew over the controls, jinking and weaving to avoid blistering volleys of energy fire. Around them, the rest of the strike force engaged in furious dogfights with Vraxar fighters. Engineering teams, push for the reactor complex, Will shouted over the din of battle. We'll hold them off as long as we can. Will split his remaining forces, assigning teams to attack multiple control centers simultaneously. He led the main thrust himself, fighting their way deeper into the heart of the base. Vraxar defenders swarmed from every direction, forcing them to advance one blood-soaked corridor at a time. Will's team moved with practiced precision, covering each other as they leapfrogged forward. Finally, they reached the central reactor chamber. Will's eyes widened at the sight of the pulsing, barely contained energy at its core. Plant the charges, he ordered. We've got seconds before they overrun us. His team worked feverishly, attaching high-yield thermionic devices to key structural points. The sounds of battle grew closer with each passing moment. Charges set, a Tellarite engineer called out. Will activated his comlink. All units, fall back to extraction points now. He took one last look at the reactor, then hit the detonator. Fire in the hole. They ran, boots pounding on metal decking as the first explosions rocked the facility. Emergency klaxons wailed as they fought their way back to their ships. Will was the last to board, diving through the airlock as a wall of superheated plasma roared towards them. Go, 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 he screamed. Their battered ships limped away from the doomed anchorage, sensors overloading from the massive energy release behind them. Through the view screen, Will watched as a titanic fireball consumed the Vraxar base, leaving nothing but a scarred radioactive husk in its wake. As the adrenaline faded, Will sagged in his chair, utterly spent. They'd done it. In a seemingly impossible way, they'd dealt the Vraxar a crippling blow. But before he could even begin to feel relief, a priority transmission cut through the static. Will's blood ran cold as he listened to the report. Despite their victory, the main Vraxar armada had already begun its inexorable advance. Will exchanged a grim look with Deneb. They'd won the battle, but the war was just getting started. Now, facing an enemy driven to the brink of madness, they would need every scrap of courage and ingenuity they possessed just to survive. Survive. The acrid stench of burning circuitry filled Will's nostrils as he strode onto the bridge of Commander Jackson's flagship. Tactical displays flickered, casting an eerie glow across the faces of the assembled officers. Deneb's antennae twitched nervously as he studied the holographic projections. "Report," Jackson barked, his eyes fixed on the sea of red icons representing the advancing Vraxar armada. A young ensign spoke up, her voice tight with tension. "Sir, long-range scans confirm it. The Vraxar main fleet is pressing forward, despite the loss of their anchorage. They've adjusted course and increased speed." Will leaned in, studying the tactical overlay. "They're going for broke," he muttered. "A full-scale assault before we can regroup." Jackson nodded grimly. "Options?" The room erupted in a cacophony of voices, each officer shouting over the others. Will remained silent, his mind racing through potential strategies. Suddenly, he stepped forward, silencing the room with a raised hand. "We give them exactly what they want," he said quietly. Deneb's antennae straightened in surprise. "You can't be serious." Will's eyes gleamed with intensity as he manipulated the holographic controls. "We make them think they've won. We retreat, cede ground, let them chase us across multiple sectors." "And then what?" Jackson demanded. "We can't run forever." "We don't," Will replied. "We turn it into a trap. Evacuate civilians, disperse our real fleet, and leave behind drone ships and false sensor readings. When they've overextended themselves, we hit them from all sides," Deneb finished, his eyes widening in understanding. The next hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. Will found himself in the heart of a massive logistics operation, coordinating the evacuation of entire star systems. He watched from the bridge as massive colony ships slipped into hyperspace, carrying thousands to safety. "Civilian evacuation of the Proxima sector complete," an officer reported. "Moving on to Tau Ceti." Will nodded, turning his attention to the shipyards. Robotic assemblers worked tirelessly, churning out fleets of unmanned drone ships. These empty hulls would form the backbone of their deception, projecting false sensor readings to fool Vraxar scouts. As the preparations neared completion, Will stood before a gathering of elite strike team commanders. "Your job is to keep them off balance," he explained, gesturing to a map of Vraxar supply lines. "Hit their depots, raid isolated fleets, make them chase shadows. Every ship they divert is one more we can trap later." The assembled soldiers nodded grimly, their faces set with purpose. Days turned to weeks as the massive deception unfolded. Will watched from cloaked observation posts as Vraxar scout ships cautiously entered seemingly abandoned systems. He held his breath as they scanned the carefully crafted sensor ghosts and holographic decoys left behind. "They're buying it," Deneb reported, monitoring Vraxar communications. "Their commanders are gloating about our cowardice as we flee before them." Will allowed himself a tight smile. "Good, let them get overconfident." The Vraxar pressed forward, their flanks stretching thinner with each passing day. Will's strike teams harassed their supply lines, forcing them to divert precious resources to defend against phantom attacks. Finally, after weeks of careful maneuvering, Will gave the order. "All units execute Operation Checkmate." Concealed torpedo bombers surged from hidden bases, slamming into the Vraxar's dangerously exposed supply lines. Simultaneously, Deneb coordinated a devastating series of ambushes. Tellarite ships, cloaked and silent, materialized at point-blank range amidst the Vraxar vanguard. The space around Will's command ship erupted in a brilliant display of weapons fire as the trap was sprung. Allied fleets dropped out of warp from every vector, encircling the scattered Vraxar forces. "All ships engage!" Will shouted, his hands flying over the tactical controls. "Cut them off and tear them apart!" The battle raged across an entire sector of space as the human and Tellarite armadas pounced on their prey. Vraxar ships, caught out of position and cut off from resupply, fought with desperate ferocity. Will's vessel shuddered under the impact of a Vraxar barrage, but he barely noticed. His eyes remained locked on the tactical display, coordinating the movements of hundreds of ships as they tightened the noose around the enemy fleet. Will's interceptor squadron screamed through space, engines blazing as they bore down on the scattered Vraxar capital ships. His fingers danced across the controls, targeting systems locking onto vulnerable points. "Alpha Wing, focus fire on that battlecruiser's port nacelles," Will barked into his comm. "Beta and Gamma, strafe their weapons arrays." Energy beams lanced out from the human fighters, carving molten furrows across Vraxar hull plating. Will's ship shuddered as return fire impacted his shields, but he pressed on relentlessly. Nearby, space rippled as Tellarite dreadnoughts phased into existence. Their massive cannons spoke, unleashing devastating volleys before vanishing again. Will watched in awe as Deneb's precision strikes crippled Vraxar flagship after flagship. "Crawford, this is Jackson," his comm crackled. "Boarding teams are ready. Get your ass back here and lead the assault." Will acknowledged, breaking off from the dogfight and racing back to the Allied fleet. He landed hard in the hangar bay, sprinting to join the waiting Marines. The deck plates thrummed beneath his feet as cutting beams sliced into the hull of a massive Vraxar Leviathan. "Go! Go! Go!" Will shouted, leading the charge through the breach. Acrid smoke filled his lungs as they pushed deeper into the alien vessel. Vraxar defenders poured fire down cramped corridors, forcing the humans to advance one blood-soaked meter at a time. Will's rifle bucked in his hands as he cut down alien after alien. His Marines moved with brutal efficiency, securing critical junctions and sabotaging key systems. They fought their way to the central core, planting charges to overload the ship's reactors. As they battled towards the bridge, a bone-rattling roar echoed through the ship. Will's blood ran cold as he recognized the sound, the Vraxar overlord. He signaled his team to fall back, then charged ahead alone. The command deck was a maelstrom of chaos. Bodies of both species littered the floor as the massive Vraxar leader tore through the remaining human boarders. Will dove into the fray, narrowly avoiding a swipe from the alien's razor-sharp claws. He emptied his rifle into the overlord's chest, but the beast barely slowed. Will cursed, dodging another attack that left deep gouges in the deck plating. His eyes darted around frantically, searching for anything he could use as a weapon. A sparking power conduit caught his attention. Will lunged for it, ripping it free in a shower of sparks. The superheated metal seared his hands, but he gritted his teeth against the pain. As the Vraxar overlord charged again, Will thrust the makeshift spear forward with all his strength. It pierced the alien's thick hide, driving deep into its vital organs. With a final, gurgling roar, the mighty creature crashed to the deck. Will stood over his fallen foe, chest heaving. He keyed his comm link. "Overlord is down! Repeat, Overlord is down!" A ragged cheer went up from the human forces, but Will felt no elation. He surveyed the carnage around him, his face grim. "No quarter," he ordered, his voice cold. "Wipe them out, all of them." The next hours passed in a blur of ruthless extermination. Will coordinated the systematic destruction of every last Vraxar vessel, turning a deaf ear to pleas for mercy. When the final enemy ship drifted lifeless, an eerie silence fell over the battlefield. Will found himself on the observation deck of Jackson's flagship, staring out at the field of wreckage. Deneb silently joined him, the Tellarite's antennae drooping with exhaustion. "We did it," Deneb said quietly, "but at what cost?" Will nodded, his eyes fixed on the devastation before them. The only cost that mattered: survival. They stood in silence, surrounded by the aftermath of their Pyrrhic victory. Will's mind raced with the implications of what they'd done and what they'd have to do to ensure it never happened again. As the battered Allied fleets began to disperse, Will made a silent vow. The next time a threat arose, humanity would not wait to be attacked. They would strike first, with overwhelming force. It was the only way to ensure their continued existence in this unforgiving universe. The stars seemed to dim as the realization sank in. Humanity had been forever changed by this crucible of violence, and the galaxy would never be the same.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.